The unseen battle in the cockpit. It was supposed to be another routine flight, nothing out of the ordinary. The aircraft was cruising smoothly at 30,000 feet, its engines humming in perfect synchronization, and the pilots were relaxed. The captain exchanged a few words with the co-pilot, both of them checking their flight data monitors, confident in the systems that surrounded them. It was a beautiful day, with clear skies and calm winds. But just as they were about to settle into their routine, it happened. A sudden, sharp alert rang through the cockpit, breaking the calm silence. The autopilot system, which was guiding the plane with precision, had failed. The screen flashed warnings: autopilot disengaged, system malfunction detected. Before they could even react, the plane lurched violently to the left. The autopilot had failed, and without warning, the aircraft was thrown into an uncontrollable roll. The controls became unresponsive, and within seconds, the plane was spinning through the air. The pilots' hearts raced as they fought against the intense G-forces that pressed them into their seats, twisting their bodies and making every movement feel like they were battling against a powerful force. The cockpit lights flickered, and alarms blared as the aircraft spun wildly, seemingly out of control. "What the hell is happening?" the captain shouted, his voice filled with disbelief. The co-pilot, equally stunned, struggled to keep his composure. What caused this sudden failure? Was it mechanical? There was no time to waste. They had to act, and fast. The entire plane was now on a dangerous trajectory, spiraling downward with every passing second. The plane seemed to have a mind of its own. Turbulence? No, it wasn't turbulence. The flight was as smooth as it had been moments ago. The wind outside? No, it wasn't the wind. It was something more insidious, something inside the aircraft. The captain reached for the manual controls, desperately trying to stabilize the plane, but every command felt like it was being ignored by the aircraft's rebellious systems. Each time he tried to level out the wings, the plane defied him, veering off in the opposite direction. His eyes flicked back to the control panel, his mind racing through all the possibilities. Electrical failure. A software glitch. The seconds felt like hours, the world outside the window spinning in every direction. At that moment, the pilots could only rely on their training, their experience, and their unshakable trust in each other. They quickly began the process of manually overriding the flight control systems, one button, one dial at a time. Their hands moved swiftly, instinctively, as the plane continued to roll. A bead of sweat ran down the captain's forehead as he glanced at his co-pilot. No words were needed. They both understood the gravity of the situation. The lives of everyone aboard were at stake. Then, in a split second, it clicked. The autopilot failure had triggered a series of cascading errors. The electrical systems had overloaded, sending false readings to the cockpit. A glitch. A simple, unremarkable glitch in the onboard system. A minor malfunction in the software controlling the aircraft's electrical circuits. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It wasn't human error. It was something far more terrifying. A glitch in the system that had threatened to tear apart everything they trusted. But they couldn't let that happen. With one final, desperate push, the captain yanked the control yoke, his grip tight enough to turn his knuckles white. The plane, fighting against him with every fiber of its being, responded. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the aircraft began to stabilize, the violent spinning subsiding into a more controlled descent. The cockpit was filled with the sounds of the systems coming back online, the alarms fading as the electrical system rebooted. The plane was no longer spinning, but the battle wasn't over. They had a long road ahead to regain full control and complete the flight safely. As the aircraft leveled out and the danger passed, the pilots exchanged a quiet look of relief. The adrenaline started to wear off, and their hands, still shaking slightly, rested on the controls. It wasn't the weather. It wasn't turbulence. It wasn't a freak accident. It was a glitch, a seemingly minor glitch in the aircraft's systems that had nearly cost them everything. The investigation revealed that a small, unnoticed software glitch in the autopilot system had triggered an electrical cascade, causing the aircraft's instruments to misread vital information. That glitch, that tiny imperfection in the system, had almost led to disaster. But the pilots had managed to wrestle control back from the brink of chaos. The flight continued without further incident, but the memory of that near catastrophe lingered in the minds of everyone involved. The glitch that nearly tore the plane apart was a reminder of how quickly things could go wrong, and how important it was to always be prepared for the unexpected. The mysterious no-landing incident. The sky was a brilliant canvas of blue as the aircraft sailed smoothly over the ocean, miles above the surface, carrying its load of weary but hopeful passengers. It was a long-haul flight, the kind that stretched across an entire continent, but everything had gone according to plan. The crew had just completed their final checks. The cabin was calm, and the destination was in sight. Soon, the passengers would be safely on the ground. But as the plane descended toward the airport, something unexpected happened, something that no one could have predicted. It was time to lower the landing gear, a routine procedure done thousands of times a day across the globe. But when the pilots pulled the lever, nothing happened. The expected thud of the landing gear descending failed to sound. The cockpit's indicators showed no sign of the gear locking into place. It wasn't an unusual sound, but an eerie silence, a silence that sent a chill through the bones of the seasoned flight crew. The captain, his calm professionalism quickly replaced by mounting concern, immediately attempted to raise the landing gear again, hoping it was a temporary glitch. But the lever remained stubbornly still. The warning lights blinked in confirmation. The landing gear wasn't coming down. Panic started to build as the pilots checked every system, running through emergency protocols. Could the gear be stuck? Was it a mechanical failure? Was the plane in danger? The seconds seemed to stretch into minutes. The control tower called in repeatedly, urgently asking if they could confirm the situation. The pilots could only relay that the landing gear appeared to be malfunctioning, and they were unsure if it was fully deployed or not. Tension mounted as they circled the airport, carefully monitoring the situation. The air traffic control tower tried desperately to communicate with the crew, offering advice, but each transmission was met with radio silence. The pilots were too focused on trying to solve the issue to respond. Every second was critical. As the plane made another circuit around the airfield, trying to give the ground crews time to prepare for an emergency landing, the pilots exchanged terse words. Their options were slim. The lack of communication with the tower only worsened their uncertainty. How would they land without knowing for sure whether the landing gear was down? The looming question haunted the cockpit. It was decided. The only choice was to attempt an emergency landing without knowing whether the gear was down or not. The pilots prepared for the worst, running through the emergency checklist in the few moments they had left. The airport prepared for impact, a clear path being cleared for the worst-case scenario, a belly landing. The moment of truth arrived. The runway loomed ahead. The aircraft's tires should have been touching the ground, but the reality was far less certain. They aimed to land as gently as possible, but the stakes were impossibly high. As the plane skidded across the runway, sparks flew from beneath the fuselage, creating a terrifying scene of friction and flames as metal scraped against asphalt. Inside the cabin, passengers held their breath. The emergency lights blinked on, signaling the imminent danger, and some braced for impact, others praying, not knowing whether they'd make it out alive. It felt like the longest, most harrowing minute of their lives. And then, a miraculous stop. The plane came to a halt, still intact, no major damage. The passengers exhaled in collective relief, their lives spared by a stroke of fortune and the skill of the flight crew. Emergency crews were on site in seconds, rushing to the aircraft to make sure no one was injured. Once the plane was safely on the ground, everyone aboard breathed a sigh of relief. The investigation began immediately, trying to figure out what went wrong. As the ground crew checked the aircraft, it was revealed that the plane's landing gear had, in fact, been properly deployed. There was no mechanical failure, no blockage preventing the gear from coming down. The cause of the uncertainty was traced to a malfunctioning sensor in the aircraft's landing gear system. The sensor, which was supposed to confirm whether the landing gear was down and locked, had failed to send the correct signal. The system read the landing gear as still in its up position, creating a false reading in the cockpit, which led to the confusion and panic. The malfunctioning sensor had caused a chain of events that had put everyone on board at risk. The entire sequence of events had been triggered by something so simple, an electronic glitch that failed to report the gear's position correctly. Although the system was designed to be foolproof, technology is never without its flaws, and in this case, a single glitch had thrown the entire landing process into chaos. The pilots, trained for every conceivable emergency, had managed to execute a flawless belly landing, ensuring everyone's safety. Their calm under pressure had been the decisive factor, and they were praised for their swift and decisive action. But for the passengers, this incident was a chilling reminder of how fragile the systems we rely on can be. What started as a routine flight had nearly turned into a disaster, all because of a simple sensor malfunction, one that no one could have predicted. The silent descent. It began like any other routine flight. A commercial airliner, packed with passengers, ascended into the sky on a calm and uneventful morning. The flight crew, experienced and professional, exchanged friendly words as the plane glided higher, breaking through the clouds. With clear skies and smooth air, the journey seemed destined for a seamless arrival. The passengers, some napping, others reading, were blissfully unaware of the drama that would soon unfold. Midway through the journey, however, something inexplicable began to happen. The crew had just completed a routine check on the flight systems when a strange alert popped up on the control panel. A subtle but concerning signal, a cabin pressure warning. The captain glanced at the co-pilot, his brow furrowing slightly. The indicator showed that cabin pressure was normal, but the aircraft continued its unanticipated descent, as if an invisible hand was gently pulling it downward. For a moment, the pilots thought it might be a simple glitch in the system. But then the plane began to lose altitude at a more noticeable rate, far faster than what should have been happening. The calm and routine flight took a turn into the unknown. Suddenly, an oxygen mask deployed in the cabin, startling passengers out of their seats. Panic spread quickly as people grabbed for the masks, unsure of what was happening. The overhead compartments rattled as the plane continued to descend. Passengers, alarmed and confused, looked around in fear. The noise in the cabin grew, a mixture of shocked murmurs and worried gasps. Oxygen was flowing, but no one knew why. The crew was equally perplexed. The cabin pressure was supposed to be regulated automatically. The systems showed no indication of a breach, no cracks in the fuselage, no depressurization. Check the pressure indicators again, the captain instructed, trying to maintain his calm, though his mind was racing. He pressed several buttons and glanced over at his co-pilot. They had just checked everything before the flight, and all had been normal. The descending plane seemed to be in perfect working order except for one thing, the mysterious drop in altitude. The cockpit alarms continued to beep at a low frequency, and the warning lights flickered as the aircraft slowly descended. The crew tried to communicate with air traffic control, but their calls were met with no response. Tension mounted in the cockpit. The pilots were at a loss. The pressure gauges were displaying normal levels, but the descent was becoming harder to control. In the cabin, passengers braced themselves. Some were frantically trying to secure their belongings, while others simply held on, gripping the armrests in fear, as the plane's rate of descent increased. The captain called for a manual override. His hands gripped the yoke as he attempted to level the plane, but the unexplainable descent continued. The co-pilot checked the flight systems again, nothing. Every dial, every screen showed normal readings, but the plane wouldn't stop its gradual, eerie drop. They couldn't pinpoint the cause. As the descent neared its peak and the cabin filled with uncertainty, the aircraft finally leveled out at an altitude just below cruising height. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was the only manageable outcome. The flight crew took a moment to collect themselves. The oxygen masks retracted, and the chaos slowly began to subside. An emergency landing was arranged as the plane continued on its altered course. The flight attendants tried to reassure the passengers, but they too had no answers. What had caused this mysterious descent? The flight landed safely, but the crew's minds were racing. This was unlike anything any of them had experienced. As investigators examined the plane after it landed, the cause was finally uncovered. But it was something so subtle, it had slipped past even the most experienced technicians and flight crews. A simple coding error in the plane's altitude control system had triggered the descent. A minor glitch in the software, which controlled the aircraft's descent parameters, had caused the plane's autopilot to read faulty altitude information. The system, though technically sound, had failed to adjust to the correct height. The result was a slow, gradual descent that no one in the cockpit could have predicted. The strange part was that the error had occurred during the plane's routine operations, unnoticed by the crew. It wasn't a mechanical failure. There was no visible sign of anything being wrong. The plane's instruments showed everything to be operating as expected. Yet, the plane had continued to lose altitude because of a minute flaw in its system. a coding oversight that no one had anticipated. The investigation concluded that the altitude control software had been programmed with a minor, but significant error, a minor bug that caused the system to misinterpret data, triggering the descent. The glitch had been too subtle for the flight crew to notice, and it had triggered a chain of events that led to the sudden and terrifying descent. Although the error was caught and corrected, it raised serious concerns about the vulnerabilities of modern aircraft systems. A bug, a minor error in the code, had caused a full-scale emergency in the skies. The pilots were cleared of any wrongdoing, and the passengers, though shaken, were unharmed. But the incident left a lingering question in the minds of aviation professionals. How many other systems are vulnerable to small, undetected glitches that could change everything in an instant? The phantom engine failure. The flight was halfway through its cross-country journey, cruising at a comfortable altitude of 30,000 feet. The engines hummed steadily, a familiar, reassuring sound to the crew and passengers alike. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, attending to the passengers, while the cockpit crew monitored their instruments, every reading appearing normal. It seemed like just another routine day in the air. Then, suddenly the calm was shattered. A piercing alarm rang out in the cockpit, accompanied by a flashing red warning light. The engine failure alert appeared on the control panel, as clear as day: Engine 1 failure. The captain's heart skipped a beat as his eyes immediately darted to the engine status gauges. This couldn't be right, he thought. The engine was running perfectly smooth. He checked again. No unusual vibrations, no changes in the temperature or pressure readings. The engine was operating as it should, just as it had from the moment they took off. Confusion turned to disbelief. What's going on? The alert was impossible to ignore. The alarm screamed at them with an urgency that contrasted sharply with the calm, steady hum of the engine. The co-pilot and captain exchanged a quick glance, both of them still processing the inexplicable warning. "Check it again," the captain ordered, his voice tight with anxiety. The co-pilot rapidly flicked through the diagnostic systems, checking the engine's parameters, running through the onboard computer's checks. But everything appeared normal. The engine was operating within the proper limits, no malfunction in sight. The warning light remained stubbornly illuminated, a phantom presence in the cockpit. Something was wrong, but what? The crew had no answers. There was no obvious issue with the engine itself, and yet the system was sending a clear message: engine failure. Panic began to rise. The captain's mind raced. The procedure for an engine failure was clear, but this wasn't supposed to happen. Not in the middle of a smooth flight with no signs of distress. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. They couldn't risk flying with a malfunctioning engine, real or not. The best course of action was to declare an emergency and descend to the nearest airport. "Prepare for an emergency landing," the captain said, his voice steady despite the chaos brewing inside. The flight attendants were informed, and the cockpit relayed the situation to air traffic control. The flight was rerouted, descending toward a nearby airport. The crew knew that the descent would take time, and the passengers needed to be prepared. The announcement was made, and although it was calm and reassuring, there was an undeniable tension in the air. The plane's altitude began to drop, the world outside the windows shrinking as the plane made its way toward the ground. As the aircraft descended, The crew continued to monitor the engine. "This doesn't make sense," the captain thought. It felt as though they were preparing for something catastrophic, but the engine was fine. The descent felt agonizingly long, each second building the suspense, each moment carrying them closer to the unknown. The moment they reached their designated landing path, a strange silence filled the cockpit. The engine failure light that had flashed so insistently earlier suddenly vanished. Just like that, it was gone. The engine was still running perfectly fine, and there was no sign of any issue. The alert had disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared. The aircraft touched down safely on the runway, and emergency services surrounded the plane as a precaution. The ground crew rushed to meet the aircraft as the plane taxied to the gate. The passengers disembarked, seemingly unaware of the drama that had unfolded above them. For them, it was just another landing. Meanwhile, the crew was left stunned and baffled. They had followed every procedure, reacted with the utmost urgency, and performed everything by the book. Yet, there had been no engine failure. There had been no malfunction. The entire incident had been a terrifying illusion, created by an electronic glitch in the aircraft's sensor system. The subsequent investigation uncovered the cause of the scare, a failure in the aircraft's sensor system, which incorrectly sent a signal that the engine had failed. A seemingly small glitch in the communication between the engine sensors and the aircraft's computer system had triggered a false alarm, causing the cockpit to believe there was an imminent engine failure when, in reality, the engine had been running smoothly the entire time. This minor fault in the system, an electronic glitch that could have been easily overlooked, had created an entirely false narrative, putting both the crew and the passengers in a state of panic. The flight crew had acted as they were trained to do, but they had been responding to a non-existent problem. The plane had never been in danger. In the aftermath, the airline reviewed the system, and updates were made to prevent such a glitch from happening again. But the psychological impacts lingered for the crew. They had been prepared for the worst, even though it was never really there. The rogue autopilot. The night sky was clear, the stars twinkling softly above the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The flight from New York to Paris was progressing as planned, the aircraft cruising at 35,000 feet, cutting smoothly through the darkened sky. Inside the cockpit, the captain and co-pilot were comfortably settled into their routine. The night was calm, the plane was steady, and everything seemed to be in perfect working order. The captain, a veteran of thousands of hours in the air, leaned back in his seat and briefly allowed himself to relax. The autopilot was engaged, as it was for most of the flight. It was supposed to be another quiet, uneventful journey. The co-pilot was running through some routine checks on the system, and the captain was going over the flight plan for the final approach to Paris. It was then that things took an unexpected turn. Without any warning, the cockpit was jolted by a sharp change in the aircraft's trajectory. The autopilot, which had been flawlessly following the flight path, suddenly veered off course. The aircraft began to tilt in a way that felt unnerving. The captain's eyes snapped to the navigation system, which showed the plane had begun to shift toward restricted airspace, an area where no civilian flights were permitted. "What the hell is going on?" the captain muttered, his heart racing. He quickly disengaged the autopilot, expecting it to immediately return control to him. But the plane refused to respond. The autopilot, it seemed, had taken over entirely, ignoring the pilot's input. The cockpit's alarm system began blaring, the lights flashing urgently, as the plane continued to drift off course. Air traffic control, noticing the strange maneuver, immediately attempted to contact the aircraft. Flight 209, please acknowledge, you are veering into restricted airspace. I repeat, you are veering off course. The captain tried to radio back, but there was no response. The autopilot was overriding the manual controls, completely silent, as though it had developed a mind of its own. A sudden wave of anxiety washed over the cockpit as the co-pilot frantically tried to regain control using the backup systems, but nothing worked. The aircraft kept accelerating toward the no-fly zone, as if guided by some invisible force. Each passing second felt like an eternity. The captain's mind raced, calculating the potential disaster. If they entered that restricted airspace without clearance, they could trigger a security response, possibly even a military interception. If they couldn't regain control in time, the plane could be intercepted by fighter jets, or worse, forced into a dangerous maneuver to avoid being shot down. We need to get control of this plane, the captain said, his voice now firm with the urgency of the situation. He reached for the manual flight controls, trying to force the plane back onto its intended course. His hands gripped the yoke, but the aircraft felt as though it was resisting. The autopilot was not giving up. In a moment of sheer panic, the co-pilot frantically hit the override switches, desperately attempting to disengage the autopilot. After what felt like an agonizing eternity, the aircraft suddenly responded. The control wheel moved, albeit sluggishly, and the plane began to drift back onto its correct course. The captain exhaled sharply, his relief palpable. The plane was safe for now, but the damage was done. They had narrowly avoided entering a restricted zone where no flight was allowed. For a few seconds, they had been at the mercy of an automated system that had failed them in the worst possible way. As the plane continued its flight toward Paris, the air traffic control tower continued to call, trying to understand what had just happened. The crew remained in tense silence, absorbing what had just transpired. The incident had left them shaken, but they had regained control just in time. The flight continued without further issue, but the pilots knew they would never forget the harrowing few minutes that nearly spiraled out of control. Once they had landed safely in Paris, an investigation was immediately launched into the incident. What investigators found was both shocking and unnerving. The autopilot's malfunction had been caused by a subtle software glitch, a failure in the aircraft's navigation system that allowed the autopilot to override the pilot's manual inputs. The malfunction was traced back to a small error in the code that governed the autopilot's interaction with the flight management system. This error had led the autopilot to misinterpret flight path data and make an unexpected and dangerous course adjustment. The glitch was incredibly subtle, so subtle, in fact, that it had gone unnoticed during pre-flight checks and had even passed through routine system diagnostics. No one could have predicted that this minor software error would escalate into a full-scale emergency in mid-flight. The airline, in coordination with the aircraft manufacturer, worked to identify and fix the issue, ensuring that it would never happen again. The incident was a wake-up call to the aviation industry, showing just how vulnerable highly automated systems could be to the smallest of errors. a system designed to keep flights running smoothly and safely, had nearly led to disaster due to one small malfunction in its coding. The phantom altimeter. The flight was going smoothly, just another routine journey, cruising at 35,000 feet. The captain and his co-pilot were focused on their tasks. The passengers settled into their seats, some asleep, others reading, as the plane soared over the vast landscape below. The aircraft, a state-of-the-art jet, was equipped with sophisticated instruments, including the crucial altimeter, an instrument that continuously tracked the altitude of the plane. In the cockpit, everything appeared normal. The altimeter readouts were stable, the engines hummed at a consistent pitch, and the flight management system showed no signs of trouble. The captain glanced at the flight path. There were no interruptions expected, no turbulence. They were on course for a smooth ride. But then, something peculiar began to happen. The altimeter, one of the most critical instruments in any aircraft, began displaying strange numbers. It showed that the plane was descending, even though the aircraft was still in the process of climbing. The altimeter readouts were at odds with everything else. The plane's engines were running normally. The climb rate was steady, and the altitude remained unchanged according to the rest of the flight instruments. The co-pilot checked the readings, then glanced at the captain. "The plane's still climbing, right?" the co-pilot asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. The captain checked the flight data and nodded. "Yes, it should be," he replied. "Maybe a glitch in the altimeter. But I'll monitor it." The cockpit crew believed the plane was still ascending. The altimeter's malfunction was subtle at first, and they didn't think much of it. It wasn't until a few minutes later, when the strange discrepancy persisted, that the captain started to grow concerned. The system had malfunctioned in such a way that it was falsely reporting the plane as descending, even though it was climbing. They were climbing through the sky, but the instrument kept telling them otherwise. They continued on course, but an ominous feeling started to settle in. The captain and co-pilot couldn't help but feel something wasn't right, but the plane felt steady. The flight continued without any immediate signs of danger. Then, the unthinkable began to happen. The alarms suddenly went off. A loud, shrill warning filled the cockpit, signaling that they were getting dangerously close to the ground. The air traffic controller's voice crackled over the radio, urgently warning the crew. "Flight 214, you're descending rapidly. Please confirm altitude. Immediate action required." The captain's heart raced. He looked at the altimeter again, descending. But they were still supposed to be climbing. The control panel showed no indication that the plane was anywhere near a danger zone. Everything seemed fine except for the faulty altimeter. But the alarm blared louder, and the urgency in the voice of air traffic control was undeniable. At that moment, everything started happening all at once. The cockpit crew quickly ran through emergency procedures, cross-checking other instruments to verify the plane's altitude. The autopilot system was also checked, but it showed that the plane was following its assigned path. There were no indications of mechanical failure. Everything seemed normal. But the terrifying thought that they were descending without even realizing it was hard to shake. The tension in the cockpit was palpable. The crew, both experienced and calm under pressure, tried to make sense of the situation. Their instruments were saying one thing, but their senses and training were telling them another. The radio crackled with more frantic calls from air traffic control. You're in a dangerous descent. Immediate action required. A sinking feeling crept into the captain's stomach as he glanced at the map. They were heading toward a densely populated area. There was no room for error. If the altimeter was wrong, they had mere minutes to avoid disaster. The ground seemed closer, but according to their flight instruments, they were still climbing. The contradiction sent a wave of panic through the cockpit. As the plane continued its descent, the alarms got louder, more insistent. The captain snapped into action. He disengaged the autopilot and took manual control, desperately trying to regain altitude. He pulled back on the yoke with all his might, but it felt like the plane was still fighting him. Could they make it in time? Was the altimeter wrong, or had they miscalculated? The clock was ticking. The tension in the cabin was unbearable. Passengers, unaware of the true danger, began to feel the descent as the plane tilted slightly. Oxygen masks dropped down, but the passengers remained mostly unaware of the life-threatening situation unfolding in the cockpit. The captain and co-pilot worked together in a desperate race against time. "We're going to have to pull up manually," the captain said, his voice steady but tight. "Get ready for turbulence." With one final, forceful pull of the controls, the plane began to level out. The descent stopped, and the plane started to climb back to its proper altitude. A collective sigh of relief filled the cockpit. They had done it, just in time. The plane had been a mere 1,000 feet from the ground when the pilot managed to pull up. The alarm stopped blaring. The aircraft leveled off, and the cockpit crew, though visibly shaken, continued their duties. The air traffic control tower, still monitoring them closely, confirmed the situation was under control. The frozen flight controls. It was a crisp, clear night over the Atlantic. The commercial airliner was making its way from New York to London, carrying hundreds of passengers on the long journey. The cabin lights were dimmed, the hum of the engines a steady, soothing presence, and the flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles, checking on passengers who were drifting into sleep. In the cockpit, the crew was relaxed. The flight was uneventful, the autopilot engaged, guiding the aircraft through the vast expanse of sky. The pilots were used to these long-haul flights, and everything was running like clockwork. The plane was cruising at 35,000 feet, far from the turbulence below, and the cockpit instruments all showed normal readings. The autopilot had been managing the flight's course, speed, and altitude, leaving the crew free to perform routine checks. But then, something happened that no one could have foreseen. A sudden, unexpected power surge coursed through the aircraft's control systems. The cockpit was filled with a sharp warning sound as all flight controls froze. The yoke, the essential control system that pilots use to steer the plane, became unresponsive. The lights on the control panel blinked erratically, and the system seemed to go into a kind of paralysis. The pilots, who had been completely trusting the autopilot, were now faced with a terrifying reality. They could no longer control the plane. For several moments, the plane was essentially flying itself, with no input from the pilots. The autopilot, which had been working perfectly fine up until that moment, was now functioning on its own, ignoring any attempt to manually override it. The controls, which should have allowed the pilots to steer the plane, were completely locked. The communication between the flight control system and the autopilot had broken down completely. "Is this a glitch?" the captain muttered, staring at the dead control panel. His co-pilot glanced at the autopilot settings. The plane was still flying, still on course, but the crew had no way of altering its direction. They tried everything, flipping switches, pressing buttons, attempting to reboot the system. Nothing. The plane was on autopilot, but it felt as though they had no control over its fate. The systems had become completely unresponsive, and the cockpit was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the radio. The pilots had a terrifying realization. If something went wrong with the autopilot, they had no way of taking manual control. The plane continued on its course, but with every second that passed, the situation grew more dire. A sense of helplessness settled in the cockpit. What if the autopilot fails? The pilots' minds raced. The thought that they might not be able to steer the plane felt like a nightmare come to life. They had trained for this, drilled for emergencies, but they had never encountered anything quite like this, a complete loss of control, even with the most advanced systems at their disposal. And then, there was another, even more pressing concern. The plane was drifting closer to unauthorized airspace, an area that was off limits to civilian flights. If the autopilot continued to malfunction and they couldn't regain control, they could end up in a situation where military jets would be scrambled to intercept them. The plane could even be shot down if it entered a restricted zone without clearance. The pressure of this knowledge weighed heavily on the crew. Minutes felt like hours. The pilots were desperately trying to stay calm, hoping that the system would reboot or somehow restore itself, but the seconds seemed to stretch on endlessly. They were helpless. The plane continued its course, seemingly without a care, while the pilots struggled against a silent adversary. A system that was supposed to be their ally had betrayed them. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, the systems flickered. The altimeter readings jumped slightly as the control panel came back to life. The yoke, which had been as still as stone, now moved slightly in response to the captain's hand. The autopilot, slowly, almost cautiously, relinquished its grip on the flight path, allowing the pilots to take control once more. Relief flooded through the cockpit, but the situation was far from over. The plane had drifted perilously close to the restricted airspace during those few minutes of control loss, and the air traffic control tower had been frantically trying to make contact with the flight, unaware of the crisis in the cockpit. The pilots quickly re-established communication with the tower, explaining the situation and assuring them that the aircraft was now back on course. The flight continued uneventfully for the rest of the journey, but the incident was far from forgotten. The aircraft landed in London without further issues, but the crew was shaken. They had just come dangerously close to disaster because of a software glitch in the flight control system. An unexpected power surge had created a communication breakdown, causing the flight controls to freeze, and for a brief moment, the pilots were completely powerless to steer the aircraft. The vanishing radar. It was supposed to be just another routine flight, a smooth, uneventful journey over the vast, open sky. The aircraft, a modern, high-tech jet, was cruising at 35,000 feet, somewhere over a remote, sparsely populated stretch of land. Below, the terrain was a patchwork of mountains, forests, and deserts, but up in the sky, everything seemed calm. The pilot and co-pilot sat in the cockpit, routinely monitoring the systems, with the hum of the engines providing a steady backdrop. The autopilot was engaged. The aircraft was on course, and the passengers in the cabin were unaware of anything out of the ordinary. The cockpit crew glanced occasionally at the radar, a vital tool that allowed them to track nearby aircraft and ensure that no other planes were on a collision course. In a region with minimal air traffic, radar data was their eyes in the sky, giving them vital information about the surrounding airspace. Then, without warning, the radar screen blinked and went completely blank. The cockpit crew, accustomed to smooth flights, froze for a moment. The radar system, which should have been providing them with detailed data on other aircraft in the vicinity, had completely malfunctioned. The pilot reached forward and pressed a few buttons, but nothing happened. The screen remained black, and the usual blip of nearby planes was conspicuously absent. "Check the radar system again," the captain said, trying to stay calm. The co-pilot quickly toggled through the various control panels, checking the radar's settings. But every attempt to restore it was met with silence. There was no signal, no data, and no response from the system. For the next few moments, the aircraft was effectively blind. The terrifying realization sank in. The plane, cruising through a remote area, had no way of knowing whether any other aircraft were nearby. They were flying in the dark, with no radar to help them avoid a potential collision. "Air traffic control. This is Flight 108. We've lost radar contact. Can you confirm our position?" The captain called over the radio, hoping for some reassurance from the ground. But the radio crackled with static. There was a slight delay, and then a voice came back, tentative, unsure. "Flight 108. We have you on radar now, but we cannot confirm any nearby traffic at this time. Please be advised to continue on your current heading. We'll monitor your progress." The pilots exchanged a look of concern. Without the radar, they had no way to confirm their exact location or altitude relative to other air traffic. The region was remote, but there were still occasional flights in the vicinity. Without the radar, they couldn't see if another plane was coming from the opposite direction, crossing their path, or flying at a dangerously close altitude. The air in the cockpit seemed to grow heavier. Every moment that passed without the radar working made the situation feel more perilous. The crew ran through emergency protocols for lost radar and consulted backup systems, but there was still no way of knowing what might be flying nearby. It felt like they were floating in the dark, utterly vulnerable. The minutes dragged on, stretching out like hours. Each second seemed more critical than the last. The pilots, though experienced, couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking on a razor's edge. What if there's another plane nearby, and we don't see it in time? That thought lingered in the back of their minds. As the aircraft continued its flight path, the tension in the cockpit mounted. The co-pilot's hand hovered over the control panel, ready to intervene if any unexpected aircraft showed up. But there was nothing, no warning, no alarms. The minutes continued to tick by, each one marked by the oppressive silence of a radar system that refused to respond. Then, just as the pilots were about to initiate a manual check on the surrounding airspace using traditional methods, a sudden ping sounded in the cockpit. The radar had come back online. The screen flickered, and the blips of nearby aircraft reappeared. The aircraft's location was confirmed, and the immediate area was clear of any traffic. The pilots sighed in collective relief, but the tension didn't fully dissipate. The sudden loss of radar data had left them vulnerable for far too long. They were back on course, but the incident had reminded them just how fragile their connection to the outside world could be. The blackout on takeoff. The sun had just begun to set, casting an orange hue over the runway as the flight prepared for its takeoff. The aircraft, a large commercial airliner, was fully loaded with passengers eager to reach their destination. The cabin buzzed with the quiet sounds of seatbelt clicks, flight attendants making final announcements, and the occasional chatter of passengers. The mood was typical for a routine flight. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As the engines roared to life, the aircraft surged forward, its massive engines vibrating beneath the fuselage. The plane began its acceleration down the runway, gaining speed, the end of the runway drawing nearer. Inside the cockpit, the pilots monitored their instruments carefully, running through their pre-takeoff checks, ensuring everything was in order. The flight instruments, showing altitude, airspeed, and heading, confirmed that everything was working normally. But then, just as the aircraft reached its critical speed and was about to lift off the ground, something went terribly wrong. Without warning, the cockpit was plunged into complete darkness. The lights flickered once, then went out entirely. The usual hum of the instruments that filled the cockpit went silent. The dials, screens, and warning lights all went dark. A complete electrical blackout had taken place. The pilots, for the first time, were flying blind. "What's happening?" the captain murmured, his voice tight with disbelief as he frantically reached for the switches and control panels. The co-pilot quickly scanned his own instruments, but everything was dead. The engines were still roaring, but without the flight instruments, they had no idea how fast they were going or what altitude they were at. In an instant, the situation became a nightmare. The plane, once in perfect working order, was now plunged into darkness, with no visible information to guide the pilots. All the usual readings, the speed indicator, the altimeter, the heading display, had completely vanished. Even the rudimentary cockpit lighting had failed. They had no idea if the plane was climbing, descending, or staying level. The captain's heart raced as his mind raced through the options. Without the instruments, they couldn't confirm their position relative to the runway, nor could they tell if they had enough runway left to abort the takeoff. If they continued down the runway without the ability to monitor their speed or altitude, they risked overshooting the runway or worse, taking off without the proper altitude. The co-pilot called for a moment of clarity, trying to assess the situation. "We have to make a decision now," he said, his voice more urgent. They had only a few seconds to make that decision before it was too late. The aircraft was still moving forward, and the end of the runway was rapidly approaching. The captain, relying on instinct more than instrumentation, pulled back slightly on the control yoke, slowing the plane just enough. He gave a quick glance at the co-pilot, who was already flipping through backup systems, desperately trying to restore control. With a steady hand, the captain disconnected the autopilot, relying solely on their own experience and the rudimentary instruments still available to them. The emergency backup systems kicked in. They weren't perfect, but they were enough. The pilots could hear the engines roaring but couldn't feel the usual reassuring vibrations that indicated the correct altitude. The plane's speed continued to increase. At the critical moment, with the end of the runway now only seconds away, the captain made a split-second decision. He called out to his co-pilot, "Abort the takeoff." He slammed the throttle back to idle, and with a forceful pull on the yoke, He initiated a hard but controlled deceleration. The plane groaned as the brakes engaged, and the tires squealed against the tarmac. For what felt like an eternity, the aircraft lurched to a halt just short of the runway's end. The entire plane shuddered as it slowed, and the cockpit, once filled with alarm and chaos, was finally quiet. The plane had come to a stop, mere feet from the end of the runway, with the aircraft still firmly on the ground. Inside the cabin, the passengers felt the brakes engage, and the flight attendants were thrown forward in their seats, bracing for something worse. However, they had no idea how close they had come to disaster. They only knew that the plane had stopped, and they had avoided something much worse. The crew immediately radioed back to the control tower, explaining the situation. Emergency response vehicles were already on standby, but the plane had avoided what could have been a catastrophic situation. They slowly taxied back to the gate, the sense of relief palpable in the cockpit.